Hey everybody, welcome. Anyone know that song? Anyone? Like a rare tune there. Just one of the things that was playing in my college days, the Tinder Sticks, and it's a song called "Tiny Tears." And I'm thinking about tiny tears today, as you'll soon see. I want us to start, though, before we dive into our material today. I want to start by with a sort of apology. I felt a little unsettled after last week's class, and I didn't feel that I felt like I didn't. It was too sprawling, and that in a sense we did some good learning. We studied, for those of us who weren't with us, we tried to take account of the figure of lot in the if you are unmuted, we can all hear you. So try to keep yourself muted. The figure of Lot, and the story of Lot ends in this great horror. That was sort of the point, and I did so much scaffolding to get us there that by the time we got it, really it's just like horrifying, material. We didn't have any time to process it. And that seems to me like a little bit of a failure, even though it is good to do that scaffolding work. But I think what happens to me sometimes in my continuous study of this book is that I start to get excited by all the connections that are. The more you study this book, the more you see connections, because it's written that way, and it's incredible over the years. They just continue to appear before your eyes, and there's something exciting about that. And so, oh my goodness, I just noticed like Lot appears, even before Lech Lecha. So I have to think about that, and then I have to think about this scene, and then I have to think about this scene, and I'm trying to map it all out, and that's good work. But I think that most of the time when we gather together like this in group learning, in sort of group chavruta, we're trying to go not wide but deep. That's really the Jewish classic mode or method of learning, which is just to really think about every single word, almost maniacally, every single word. And so, you can see the perils of trying to, encompass an entire story as it appears throughout the Torah. There's almost too much to do, certainly in an hour. So anyway, I felt a little unsettled about that. And especially with such a trauma at the end, a double trauma at the end of Lot's story, I felt like we didn't really talk about it. We just sort of horrified at the end, and that was it. So as a kind of corrective this week, we are going to not go back to that story. We stay in our Parsha, but we're going to go deep. We're going to look just at one verse today, and even just at one phrase, and we're going to use what I have found to be the tool that allows me to go deep, the tool really that brings me back when I get too sprawling in my thinking about the Torah, and that tool is the tradition of Parshanut, the tradition of Torah commentary. This class is called Parsha study with the Parsha nut, but that's a play on the word Parshanut. This tradition of Torah commentary that is really like the classic, the grand tradition of commentary on the Torah that is like my great love. And today we're going to see some selections from that. We're going to use our tradition to sink us deep in to one verse in the Torah. Okay, so let's say a blessing to start ourselves off with a little focus, a little gratitude for this tradition we have. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so what we are going to be dealing with today I said we're going to pause and go slow and go deep, and this moment requires us to do so because this week's Parsha is Chayei Sarah, and Parshat Chayei Sarah begins with death. with Sarah's death. And it's very notable. I mean, it's called like the life of Sarah. That's the name of the Parsha. So it starts with, well, we'll soon see. It starts with a summary of the life of Sarah. But also what we have here in these first few lines is something that we haven't seen before, because we have had a lot of death in these stories, in these generations. We've been witness to death. In fact, the first family unit, it quickly leads to a death. So death is not foreign to us as readers of the Torah, but this is the first time we have a kind of a response to death. In other words, the first time we really see mourning in the Torah. This is it. This is where the tradition of mourning begins. And here's where our tradition starts to look to see clues for how we mourn and what it means to take account of death. They say that death is the oldest record of civilization that we have. That is the first marker that human beings are advanced in creating societies. For the oldest forms of social activity that we find are death rituals, graves. And that's really important. Like, there's something about our consciousness of our own death and the death of others, and what that means to us, and our inability, I think, to fully grasp its meaning is a huge feature of our lives. It's a huge feature of our communal lives. I mean, I know people on this Zoom have suffered death in the past year. Some of you in the past month, and we all will at some point, and we all will die. It's this great thing that we fear, and yet it's inevitable. I mean, it's such a big topic. Okay, I'm not going to just try to talk about sprawling, but this is a moment where we start to see our tradition processing in that way. So, like, thinking about what it means to experience and to be with a death, and the death of someone that you couldn't be closer to, and that's Abraham and Sarah. They were a unit from the start. We don't know Abraham pre-Sarah. We meet him, he's married to Sarah. So okay, so without further ado, let's dive in and take a look at the death of Sarah and the response of Abraham and the community around. Okay, so take a look at your source sheet here. I'll actually just share it, but I'm going to give you a source sheet that you can take a look at. Take a look at the first verses of our Parsha this week. Okay, here we are. Vayu chayei Sarah 100 shana ve-20 shana ve-7 shanim shnei chayei Sarah. And Sarah's life came to 127 years. And if you hear the Hebrew, there's a lot of Midrash on the Hebrew, which is that Sarah's life came to 127 years, right? There's a little bit of a parsing them out. So that's one of the classic questions in this verse, but not what we'll focus on today. We'll be focusing today on this next verse. So let's pay careful attention, especially to the bolded part. Vatamat Sarah b'Kiryat Arba, hi Hebron, be'eretz Canaan. Vayavo Avraham lispod leSarah v'livkota. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and to cry over her. Lispod leSarah v'livkota. Lispod is related to the word that indeed we translate as eulogy, which is hesped. At a funeral, hespedim are given, eulogies. And it's just funny because eulogize feels to me like such a high level vocab word, and I wouldn't think that it was the best word to translate this, but it is the best word. There isn't a better word for lispod. It is that act of, and we can think about what it is, but speaking praise over the dead. Okay. I mean, I don't want that to be the only definition, but just like part of what we're going to do is figure out what is going on here. He came to eulogize Sarah and to cry over her. That's what he came to do. Then Abraham rose up from his dead. Vayakam Avraham me'al pnei meito, vaydaber al bnei chet lemor, and he spoke to the Hittites, saying, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. I am a resident foreigner among you. Tnu li achuzat kever imachem, vekbera meti milfanai. Sell me a burial site among you so that I may remove my dead for burial, so that I may bury my dead before me. Okay, there's lots of stuff here. As when we go deep, like here's another example of our tradition going deep. A resident foreigner, ger vitoshav, is a really interesting phrase. It sort of means I am foreign, but I am also I am a resident. So there's a little I belong here and I don't belong here in that. And from here we go on to my Zoom is not working properly. Hold on. Huh? Stop share. Ooh, something weird. From here we go on to the transaction of him purchasing the burial site, and there is more that is related to this scene, but just these 4 verses I think are enough for us to sit for a moment and really think about what's happening now and what's happening to Abraham. Where is he at? What is he doing? Okay, I want to take now comments on that, but before we do, I thought it would be a good I thought it'd be a good opportunity to use the chat feature just to ID. Like I want to hear from you when we begin to analyze, but let's just ID. What do we see Abraham doing here? What are the things? Can we list them? Abraham, what is he up to in response to Sarah's death? Let's just see if we can list. If you have just a 1 word or a sentence to put in the chat. Eulogize, good. Eulogize is 1. Bury is 1. Buy a burial plot. Anyone who has dealt with a death knows that it's incredible how quickly we're flung into logistics. Buying a burial plot, finding a plot. Remember, present, crying, celebrating the life. Okay, so maybe a definition of hesped and crying, celebrating the life and crying, burying, eulogizing, gets up from his dead. Some process of actually beginning to get up from the most visceral mourning and move into finding a place to bury her, eulogize her, arrange logistics, crying over, legitimizes the land she's burying on by making it a legal transaction, making sure that he owns that land. Get her away from my face, meaning the literal language. I have to maybe there's some point where he has to remove himself from seeing her. Honor her, deal with the Hittites, sitting with the dead, spoke to the Hittites. How does Abraham know where he wants to bury Sarah? Right, how is he thinking? And people do. I want to make sure that my mother is buried in New York, in Israel, in our town, near my father, right? So that's part of it too. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, good. So that's a good list. We've generated sort of what's going on here. Now let's think, okay, so what does this mean? Like what are we seeing that mourning means? What does a death, and the death of Sarah, Abraham's wife for decades, what does it call forth from Abraham or from us is sort of what we're also asking. So let's start with Florian.
This was my Torah portion. The word v'rikotav, the small cough, in the Torah, when the letters are changed, either small or fallen, there's often a strong meaning. And my rabbi explained to me at the time that was the beginning of the mourning customs in Judaism, that you were to cry or to mourn, but because it's a small cough, that letter indicates that it should be measured grief and that we should go back and serve the living. So that's the first point. And the second point is on the two words resident, alien. Resident can mean one who dwells on the physical level. The second word, a foreigner rather, can mean that you're really only temporarily on this earth, that you're only passing through.
Okay, good. Florine's beginning to do some of this work for us of really digging deep into this verse as she thinks about Abraham mourning. It isn't just a question of what he's doing, but how is this phrased? What are the words that we are using? And then Florine says when we study Torah, there are other little it's not nuances, but little curiosities in the writing that we notice. And one of them is that there are certain letters in the Torah that by tradition are written bigger or smaller. And this is one of the otzira, the small letters. So in this word here is to cry over her. Velif kota, to cry over her. Okay. So it is true that by tradition, there is a small kaf there. So one wonders, what does that mean? Does it mean the tradition is to write it that way? So the Torah is giving us a mourning response, but as usual, it's still the Torah, the way Torah's writing is so terse, so like kind of fractured, just like little moments. And so we really have to pay attention. He's crying here. We've never seen Abraham cry before. My God, he didn't respond when he was sacrificing his son. Where were his emotions? Here he's crying. So take note that he's crying. But look at it deeply, and Florine looks at it deeply and sees there's a reduction in that crying. There's something happening there. One of the commentaries we're going to look at is going to address that, as Florine just addressed it. But I would ask you to think with Florine, what does that mean? What does it mean that the tradition writes this how would you interpret a small letter in the midst of Abraham's tears? Sort of an interesting idea. Okay, let's keep going. Eventually, we're gonna break and go into the commentaries. Let's hear a few more thoughts on just these verses. Payam?
Is the Hebrew for dead also plural?
The Hebrew for dead in the verse or in general?
In the verse.
No, I think it's singular. I think that's right. You mean from his dead, meto? Yeah,
right.
Just one.
Yeah, because it's weird in English because dead is plural and it switches from the singular to the plural. Because at first he's saying Sarah, and it's a specific person, and then he goes to the amorphous plurality of dead. I just found that transition.
Rose up from his dead, you mean?
Yeah, I found that
or
transition.
Remove my dead for. Good. Okay. Actually, I'm less. It's always in the singular, but I think you are actually picking up on something, which is that there is something funny about this. He rose up from his dead. What does that mean? His dead. Why not say Sarah? Why keep referring to her as his dead, right. My dead?
Specifically because the sentence before it was Sarah. He just abruptly switches from Sarah to dead to the plural.
Right, and let's switch to a pronoun. Right? Like Sarah uses she, her pronouns. Let's switch to her. Like, why his dead? Why? Okay, so that's and let's do some of this work also that Florine and Payam are doing. Let's join them in asking all of the questions that emerge. What are all the questions that emerge? What are we wondering about in this scene? Soon we're going to look at the commentators. The commentators, they always begin with a question. So questions like, why is the kaf small? Questions like, why does he keep talking about his dead, his dead? And actually, we're going to see commentators that address both of those questions, which is a way of saying, Florina and Payam are onto something. The phrase for that in our tradition is Baruch Shekivanta. Wow, Blessed are you whose thoughts were in line with the sages. Okay, let's take one more thoughts before we head into the sages. Noah?
Yeah, this one, it's always a difficult Torah portion, but I really like the way it's arranged. First, he did the eulogy, the chesped, then he cried, and finally, Vayikam Abraham. Then it's like he's sort of, it's the same word we're using to wake up or to stand up, that he's sort of now out of that sort of, not really out of, but more he's bringing himself back to consciousness that his wife of so many years is no longer with him. So I think it's just a nice story flow that he's telling the life and crying and then rising and talking to others, but after the mourning process has been done, or he's going through.
Okay, great. So that's also Baruch Shekivanta. You're also asking questions that have been kicked up in the tradition that people have been bothered by before, and that's a good sign. And part of what Noah's asked first of all, Noah focuses on the language of Abraham getting up, almost like waking up, and what is what does that mean? What does it mean that Abraham gets up and this moment? But more to the point, or I should say, even bigger picture, Noah is just thinking about all of the sequencing here, the order of what Abraham does, because we have 4 verbs, or I guess at this point we have 4. We have vayavo, Abraham came, to eulogize, lispod l'Sarah, and to cry over her, velifkota, then Abraham rose up. So that's another thing that we're going to see our commentators are going to see the tradition try to think about. Why did he come and then eulogize and then cry and then get up? Is there an order there? And is it the right order? Do we imagine that's what we would do? Okay, so okay, I want to now dive into the commentators, but let's unearth any other questions we might have. And again, let's try to use the chat. I'm going to try to get more voices out of our Zoom by using the chat more than I do. I can't read it during the class, but for these sorts of questions where you just want to throw something out, I think actually the chat can be a really great feature. So if you have any other questions just on these quick verses that we looked at, and especially the crying, the eulogizing, the coming, the getting up of Abraham. So I see Marlene asking, I see Miriam actually asking, why in Kiryat Arba? Okay, good, the place. Marlene asking, why does he eulogize first and cry second? Richard's asking, were Abraham and Sarah separated? Why did he come to her? Great question. Where is he coming from? Where is he coming from? I would cry first and then would be able to eulogize, says Miriam. Ah, great. That's a sequencing question. And I'm excited when I'm seeing these. I'm like, yes, that Rashi had that question. The Kliyakar had that question. The Chatan Sofer had that question. And we're going to take a look at them soon. So let's keep going. Why wasn't Abraham with Sarah when she died? Where were each of them? Does it denote acceptance and now ready to face the community, the getting up moment? Usually a eulogy is in public. Are there others are other people around? Great question. Saying he got up means he sat. Right, he was, okay, good. Maybe this is where we start to see the tradition. Matt, who knows this, who has just sat through Shiva, and knows that we sit for a week, right? I used to think it was called Shiva because Shiva, you sit. It's actually Shiva 7, but it's like I always think of it as the sitting period, right? So that's right. That's a good both sensitivity to the language and one that and the wisdom of a mourner that Matt is giving us. This is the first time in the Torah that feelings are introduced for anybody. Have we seen crying before? Many die, but do we hear about crying? Good. Right? This in some ways is that's the crux of our exploration. Abraham is emoting. How do we read this? Sarah is the soul death caused by the binding of Isaac. Her heart is broken and then she dies. Ooh, someone, Brucha shekivant. Sat Shiva. Why is this the first thing he thinks to do when he gets up from morning to define his status, his sense of where and how he belongs? Right? He flings into transactions and ownership and property. It almost feels too technical there at the end, doesn't it? Could coming mean the moment where Abraham becomes aware that Sarah is dead? He comes to her death. Beautiful read. Not only why eulogizing first, but why words talking first? That's the pattern from creation. Interesting. To respond to death with words, right? Words first. Is that a Jewish trope? I would be more quiet, like Job, for a period before talking or being in conversation, just to absorb this loss of my life partner. All right, let's stop I'm gonna read whatever's there, and then we're gonna go into the text. He got up to do business with the outside world. What did God say to Abraham about death? Great question. This is a prophet. Does he know something about death? Is he tuned into that? What is he supposed? Is there a spiritual? Is he teaching us something here? Who did he eulogize to? David asks. Could the crying be the deepest feeling before entering his new life? Did it transform him? Does his dead have tense? Is it singular? Right. It is singular, and tense is a good question. I guess it's present. I guess it's a noun here. A mate, a dead body person. Okay, great. So we've done. I feel like, see, this is the work that we really had to do last week. That I felt I sort of robbed us of, or the time robbed us of last week. Just like, let's ask all the questions that come to us. Let's really go deep here. Now, we won't be able to answer them all, but let's take a look now at some of our commentators answering some of these questions, and you'll see you've anticipated them. You have anticipated them, and that's a good sign. And I have chosen these three commentators because this is a moment of going deep and inward. And these commentators, I think, do some of the best work of getting into the psychology of our characters. And one of them is just Rashi. And that is because Rashi borrows from the Midrash, and the Midrash, the tradition of Midrash, of rabbinic interpretation that paralleled the Talmud, it was a tradition that is remarkable. You'll be surprised how psychologically thoughtful they are. And here you'll see that they are psychologically thoughtful in the way that Leah Matsui was. So take a look at this here. This is one of the great Rashis. This is one of the great pieces of Torah. Every year at Parsha Chayei Sarah, I hear some rabbi getting all excited to talk about this Rashi. So this is just it's a keeper. It's a jewel, and it's also horrifying in what it is suggesting. So let's take a look. Rashi says to eulogize Sarah and to cry over her. Now, we have to think a little bit, like as we read the answer, what was it that Rashi was asking? What is he providing us an answer to? But this is what he says. The narrative of the death of Sarah follows immediately on that of the binding of Isaac. And that is true. Chapter 22 of Genesis is the binding of Isaac. It ends the Parsha, and then chapter 23 of Genesis begins with the death of Sarah. Okay, so as usual, the Midrashis are interested. They're starting with textual questions, but they're saying deeper things, right? So the narrative of the death of Sarah follows immediately on that of the binding of Isaac. Why? Because through the announcement of the binding, that her son had been made ready for sacrifice, for slaughter, really, it should say. And had almost been slaughtered. It really should be slaughtered. I mean, nishchat is not sacrifice, it is slaughtered. Ready for slaughter. And had almost been slaughtered. Her soul flew from her and she died. Her soul flew from her. Parsha, like it burst up from out of her, like a flower, like it burst up. It flew from her and she died. That, my friends, is a doozy of a Rashi. So the basics I think we can see, right? Chapter 22 is the binding of Isaac. Chapter 23 is the death of Sarah. Why are they, one of the questions Rashi's asking is, why are they up against each other? This teaches us that this informs this, that it was because of the binding of Isaac that Sarah died. Because of the hearing of the binding of Isaac that Sarah died. Now, okay, let's think about that though for a second. Like what first of all, what does that mean? Her soul like flew out of her, right? Her soul flew, she heard and her soul flew out. What are we imagining Sarah's death to be? Can we give a little more texture to that description? Ariella, can you do that for us?
Like a broken heart.
Yeah, so succinctly and perfectly put, she died of a broken heart. She died of a broken heart. But let's think about that. There are many broken hearts, and some of them are tender and sweet. But this is a heart that, in this moment, the heart was crushed. The heart was broken. Why? Like let's think about what this is saying about Sarah and her. She wasn't mentioned in the binding of Isaac. So let's think about, what is Sarah's relationship to the binding of Isaac? We always talk about Abraham's, but what did she feel? And she heard that her son had nearly been, what did she feel? Ariella, do you want to continue to pick up on that?
Yeah, that her child that it took forever to conceive could have, in a fleeting moment, had been gone.
Good. She felt everything that we expected Abraham to feel. Like, no, God, no. This is no, I won't, no, I cannot, this cannot be. This is unthinkable. And as Ariella says, I've been waiting for this my whole life. And now and it almost was taken away from me. But, so that's part of it. And what an insertion into the narrative. Sarah died of shock at hearing about the binding of Isaac. Now, let me ask you another question. What does it mean that she only just heard about it? That she didn't know? What does that mean? Matt, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, that was my question. Why do we know that she dies at hearing the whole story, as opposed to she dies when they leave? You know, I'm envisioning Abraham, her partner, saying, hey, God told me I got to go off the kid and I'll be back in 2 weeks. And he leaves, Sarah dies, Abraham comes back. That actually flows a little better, but the rabbis are giving us that other story. So there's a reason they want us to think that even hearing about his saving still is horrific.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. I like what Matt is suggesting here, that if you really imagine it, I would, it flows better to my ear too. Like Sarah gets up in the morning and Abraham and Isaac are gone. And she's like, where did they go? And eventually someone says, well, I don't know, it didn't look good. He was carrying wood and fire with him, you know? Like, you know, that it was a period of days of Sarah thinking, you know, I think that's an interesting way to think about Sarah hearing the news. But Matt's right that the rabbis are imagining, no. Sarah heard about what happened after, because part of what she heard about was that Isaac survived, but that still killed her. Still killed her. What killed her? Isaac's alive. What killed her? You know, I mean, what Ariella said, that it was very, very close, but more than that, right? More than that. Who wants to respond to this? More than that.
Rabbi?
Yeah, Robert.
I read somewhere that she was told that Abraham took Isaac and he went to sacrifice him because God told him so. And she heard this story and she had like a heart attack hearing this story. She didn't hear the end that, oh, he was saved. All she heard was he was going to be saved. He's sad. And Abraham does what he tells him to do. And he went off to do it. And she passed away before the end of the story.
That's great. That's great. Also, y'all are doing great work. And I think there are various midrashim that say this. Rashi's borrowing from a midrash called Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer that says, oh, kimat shelo nishchat. He was almost slaughtered. But I think there are midrashim, and I suspect that, I don't know. I'll have to go look it up. But I like the way you're narrating. Like the whole, this builds on what Matt is thinking. The whole thrust of this is that she didn't, that makes it more dramatic. She didn't know that he had survived. All she knew was her husband took him to be killed, to kill him. And look, this is what I'm driving at, right? What is bothering Sarah? What broke her heart? What crushed her is that Abraham didn't tell her. Abraham had been married to her for, I don't know, 100 years. And he got up one morning and took her only lonely child and went to kill him. Abraham has another child, by the way. So it's really freighted. It's really loaded. Okay, all right. Let's hear some more folks respond to this. Marianka.
So previously, there is a relationship between God, Abraham, and Sarah. Sarah is always supportive. She runs and makes the bread for the angels. And in this situation, to me, it looks like Sarah is suddenly excluded from that relationship between God and Abraham. She's not told, what's going to happen. God doesn't talk to her and say, look, I want Abraham to take Isaac up to the mountain and sacrifice him. So I think she almost died, to me, out of feeling of betrayal and loneliness, because suddenly she's cut out of this relationship.
Yeah. Think about what this kind of midrash is saying about the last chapter of Abraham and Sarah. And on some level, I think that this is read, we're to read this as sort of as something everybody would have understood, including Abraham. And think about what this means for Abraham, that he came home and he didn't have to kill his son, but his wife died because of what he did. Oh, we made it, we're back. But it's too late. So think about that as well. Let's see, I want to hear from Allison, Stephen, and Agnes.
It strikes me that Sarah has always had so much trust in Abraham. Like even in Lech Lecha, we always think, oh, Abraham heard the word of God and had the courage to follow it, but Sarah had the courage to follow Abraham, and she would have left everything that she'd known. And throughout the chapters that we've read about their relationship, Sarah just seems to be like a very devoted wife. And the fact that Abraham was willing to do this without consulting her, is a betrayal. But it's also like how earth-shattering, the two, let's say, forces, I guess, that Sarah would have had total faith in or trust in or something, both God and Abraham. To have betrayed her in this way, it's so shocking.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful that you were kind of amplifying the anguish here by reminding us that Sarah, of all people, we were all shocked by the binding of Isaac, but Sarah's the person who threw her life and her lot in with this mission. Abraham hears a call and he says to his wife, God's talking to me. And Sarah says, okay, let's go. And, and then 20 years later, 30 years later, decades later, it ends in this same man going to kill her child. Wait a minute. What kind of God is he hearing from? Why did we go on this trip to begin with? What was I thinking getting into this? It's a lot. This small Rashi adds so much trauma, so much new trauma, or maybe not new, maybe, oh yes, of course. Of course, this is what Sarah was going through. We didn't think about the mother is back home. So of course, oh my gosh, this death of Sarah is not like the last thing that happened in her life was the binding of Isaac, but she wasn't there for it. That's part of what this Rashi is doing. Stephen?
Yeah, just sort of playing on that and bringing it out a little further. What the Akedah, what the binding of Isaac is about, is Abraham's silence, his inability to communicate, his unwillingness or impossibility of communicating what he's about to do to anyone, let alone to Sarah, not to Isaac and not to Sarah. It's so interesting that in the next chapter, after arriving, what he does is speak. He eulogizes. And so that silence, which had to be weighing on him as well, is now broken by the eulogy. And he now words come back to him that he didn't have before. And sort of the transition between those two chapters, which stresses the silence that he could not communicate with her. And now only after she's dead does he speak in that sense.
Okay, I love this narration that Stephen is giving us, because it really begins to respond to a question that came up earlier. How did this experience transform him? And now what we're talking about is the experience of potentially leaving the Akedah, the binding of his son, arriving at death, the juxtaposition of those two. Like, what Abraham gets up from there? It's a different Abraham. And Stephen says the Abraham that came back to a wife who had died because of what he'd done, potentially, as Rashi reads it, is an Abraham that suddenly is bursting forth with all of those emotions that he had repressed, with all of the words that he had not dared to say. Now they are coming out. He's beginning to actually talk about his inner life, his emotional inner life, which we haven't known that much about, this prophet who started, we don't know, like, what did he feel? But he feels it here. He feels it. All right, I want to take us, we'll hear from one more comment from Agnes.
I just want to say, I would like to think that she would feel a little guilt too, because the last thing we see her do is send off another child into the woods to certain death. And I think what you said, Stephen, also makes it click to me that these are both situations where somebody tells Abraham to do something and he doesn't speak, he does it. I mean, he says that he's distressed when he sends off Ishmael and Hagar, and just as Sarah is excluded from the conversation about Isaac, Hagar is separated from her home and her context. I think that there must be a moment of her saying, like, oh, is this what it feels like to be cut off? Is this what it feels like to lose a child? And whether it makes her reflect on her own choices.
Yeah. This is a very helpful reminder, and it follows a couple of helpful reminders about the part of what Rashi's done is he's given us a context. Like, it's starting to imagine, well, how does this death come to be, and putting it in the context of their lives. And Agnes continues giving us further and further context. Like, oh, it's not like, oh, it was a great life until suddenly you got up one day. And no, there were other moments where Sarah was the person who was heartless and casting Abraham's son out into the desert. Was this a revenge? How do we deal with the trauma of this family that seems to have ended at this moment in all the kids are dead? Where did everybody, and I'm not clean, I'm not innocent in that, right? These Abraham and Sarah are this sort of like power couple in some ways, but they had a hard life, and they were not always kind to each other. They were not always good to each other. And you can say that of both of them. And I don't know who among us would have been. I mean, what kind of life is that? I mean, you know what I think? I think that because of our time, what I want to do is skip the second source. I was just going to do a little, I recommend it to you. It's my favorite commentator, the Kliakar. And he just does a really beautiful investigation of like the psychology of crying, eulogizing, where we go here, where we go, what we do first, and thinking about what all this meant to Abraham. I recommend it to you. But because of the conversation we're having and because we really only have time for one more, I want to jump forward to the Khatam Sofer, who is much later. Khatam Sofer is a not 20th century, 19th century European Hungarian Jew who was a real leader in his community, and it really started what we now think of as like ultra orthodoxy, like hardcore, like build the walls, like keep Judaism pure, kind of. But he was a brilliant guy, and he for being such a starker, you know, his commentary has surprising psychological insight and inventiveness. He's a very brilliant thinker, and so I want to take us here. And the reason I want to take us here is because I think this first Rashi that connects the death of Sarah back to the binding of Isaac, that charged us so immediately. The idea that, wait a minute, we have to think about all of the other figures of death and loss that this couple has had to process. So the Khatam Sofer does this really kind of crazy thing, which is that he unites a bunch of like fragmented ideas or midrashim into this kind of new legend. And I was so struck when I read it, I couldn't believe he was saying it. It's such a weird thing to say, but such a deep thing to say. So see what you think. I mean, here we're going to get another backstory, but not one that's immediately obvious. But what the Khatam Sofer is doing, that will be clear to us, is exactly what Florine did at the outset, which is he's wondering about that little kaf, that little letter. Okay, so take a look at what the Khatam Sofer says about it. It's like really threw me for a loop here. Okay, so the Khatam Sofer, and Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and to cry over her. Okay. The kaf in to cry over her is one of the small letters in the Torah. Min aleph bet ze'ira. Okay. And it seems to me that the little letter, what is it doing there? It's a hint to what it says in the Talmud in Bava Batra. And this is true. This is a different legend that the Talmud gives in Bava Batra. In the next chapter begins after the burial of Sarah with, and God had blessed Abraham with everything. V'Hashem berach et Avram bakol. Here it is in the Hebrew. V'Hashem berach et Avram bakol. With everything, bakol. That actually means, says the Talmud, that Abraham had a daughter, and bakol was her name. Right? Now, this is a great drash. This is a great drash because what this is saying is God had blessed Abraham with everything, bakol, and the rabbis are saying, wait a minute though, he didn't have everything. He didn't have a daughter. It's a cool Midrash. He had 2 sons, but he didn't have everything because he never had a daughter. So this is actually, and God blessed everyone with Abraham with everything, bakol, meaning a daughter. And I actually once knew a girl named Bakol, and it was from this, right? Like that it would be like the daughter as the fulfillment of everything. Okay, so that's a cool Midrash, but this is from the Talmud. The next part, the Khatam Sofer comes up with on his own, I believe, because it's not in the Talmud. Take a look. So Abraham had a daughter, and Bakol was her name. But she died. She died. And he doesn't say much about it, but you can imagine, we don't see her. So did she die in childbirth? Did she die early on? Is there some other traumatic story we don't know about? But she died. Now, the next part, I'm not asking anyone to sign on to, because the psychology here, I'm not sure is, I'm not sure it's like the most sensitive or modern or whatever, but I'm not asking you to buy into it. I just want you to think about what he's saying here about their relationship. While Sarah was alive, he did not feel as severely the loss of his daughter. because he was not alone. Ki lo haya levado. And because he could take comfort in Sarah. V'gam haya mitnachem b'Sarah. And by the way, he lists those as two separate things. He was not alone, and he could take comfort in Sarah. But when she also died, and he was left alone, he began to feel the loss and to become bitter and cry also over the death of his daughter. Now, I want to ask you why he wanted to throw this in here. Why did he want to conflate these stories? Why did he want to layer death upon death? But just so we get the fullness of his interpretation, he should have done this sort of at the start, but he leaves his proof till the end. And it's just cool for those of you who like the wordplay in Hebrew. For we know that in general, that smallness indicates loss and diminishing. So that's what, remember, it was about the kaf. The kaf is a hint to the daughter. So we know that the smallness indicates loss and diminishing. That's not a very good reason. But the next one is, but also if you remove the kaf from and to cry over her, velivkota, it reads, and for her daughter, velibita. So it's like, he wants to say it is hinting to us, the Torah wants to say, take out the kaf. Take out the kaf and you get, he came to eulogize Sarah and her daughter. In other words, he imagines that what Abraham is doing here is he's at the funeral and he's saying, and we also must grieve the daughter that we had together, the daughter that died. Now, what a thing. What a thing to suggest. I mean, when the Talmud does it, it's kind of good news. Yay, Abraham also had a daughter. And he wants to say, oh no, there was more going on. He was also mourning that loss. So any thoughts on why? We've just seen Rashi connect it to the almost death of Isaac. Now, why is the Khatam Sofer connecting it to the also death of a girl we never met? Any thoughts or theories on this?
It makes me think that maybe the Khatam Sofer had this problem himself, that maybe he had a daughter. And so it reminds him of the pain that he experienced.
I like this comment because part of what I want us to see here is that the rabbis are just like us. When they see death in the Torah, they think of the death they've experienced. And, they've led difficult lives, many of our sages and rabbis throughout the generations, and they suffered loss. And death in childbirth was much more common as we go further in death in childhood, early infancy. So maybe it was common. And I think part of what Robert's suggesting is, and also death evokes death. When Abraham's wife dies, surely he's thinking of his daughter that died. Surely Abraham is thinking of his uncle that died. First thing we learn about Abraham is that he had an uncle named Haran who died, right? Like maybe at times of death, we're just plunged into the reality of death all around us. And what do we do with that? Now we're in it and we're thinking of it, and it terrifies us, and it's all encompassing. And the young and the old, how do you process that? To lose a child, lose a wife, but to know as you lose the wife that what you share with that wife is that together you lost a child. It's like too much. And so imagine these two stories, her hearing about Isaac and him thinking about Bachol, and just sort of like the trauma that they lived with, that they sat with together. All right, let's take a few closing comments. Mark?
What strikes me right off the top is that this is a really good example of how to probe the Hebrew and the way in which the calligraphy of the text can add meaning to a particular word or a phrase. I would be very curious to know if the Khatam was mystical in any way, because I think he's teasing out more meaning. And he's basically saying, when I look at that small kaf, what is that coming to teach me? Why the small kaf right then and there? And he's able to do that switch from mourning her to his daughter. And if the Khatam was a mystic, then he would be able to say, this is the sod, this is the secret level, or this is the remez, the hint level.
Yeah.
So it gives more meaning.
I think you're
okay.
exactly right, Mark. I think that this indicates the Khatam Sofer here is post, like, the explosion of Kabbalah. And so he's not a chassid. We usually associate that with chassidim, but almost everybody in kind of mainstream Judaism becomes Kabbalistic after that period. And so the idea of like wordplay and hidden messages and the Torah, Mark is really right that part of what's beautiful about this analysis is that it imagines that the Torah wants us to stop and notice that there's something missing. That it's the letters drawn small for a reason. And just as they wanted you to notice when it says that God had blessed Abraham bakol with everything, you wanted you to think, well, it wasn't everything. What about the daughter? So to here, they want us to remember that like something was, missing. Something was, and maybe it's connected. Maybe there's a hint here to some hidden loss, hidden the way that the kaf is hidden. Okay, I want to give Leah Matsui a chance to speak, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, I have a question about something that was said previously. I thought that Abraham had a brother who died, an uncle.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Sorry, that's my bad.
Yeah.
Yes, his brother.
And I thought the Midrash talks about that Abraham was thrown into the furnace and he did not burn. He was punished. He got thrown into the furnace. He was punished for bashing up the idols. He did not burn. And his brother, his younger brother, who was Lot's father, also said, I believe in God, so throw me into the furnace and I won't burn either. But you see, he did burn. Mm. So Abraham starts out on the journey, I think, guilty and responsible for the death of his brother. And that would explain his sort of soft spot for Lot, who's a little bit sleazy, but still treats him with respect throughout Lot's life.
This is really, thanks for bringing us back to that. And you're right. I was thinking of Lot, whose uncle is Abraham, but you're right. It's Abraham's brother that dies, Haran, and that's the first thing we learn about Abraham. Your comments, Leah, are so just blew my mind, because you're framing there. I've never thought of it that way. That Abraham, in a sense, is someone who survives while, like, to a certain extent, at the cost of those around him. I never thought about it that way before. Like he's sort of born into being the elect because his brother died. He prays for Lot, but as far as he knows, Lot dies. Rabbi Brous said so powerfully this year in her sermon, we know that Ishmael lived in the Torah, but Abraham doesn't know that. And Isaac almost died because of him. And it's like, and now Sarah's died because of him. This is what it means to be around Abraham. He survives, but everyone around him is annihilated by the terror and the power and the selection and the stark difficulty of life with Abraham. And he has to feel a little survivor's guilt at that, does he not? And so I want to leave you with the last little piece here. It's just a little snippet from the Midrash, but boy, what a snippet. And it turns back to that phrase that so many of us looked at today, Vayakam me'al pnei meto, that he got up from his dead. And that phrasing, which so many of you wanted to read, is like, oh, there's more going on there. So take a look at what the Midrash says. Midrash says, Abraham rose up from his dead. Vayakam Avram me'al pnei meto, melamed shaya roeh malach hamavet matris knegdo. This teaches that he saw the angel of death coming after him. It's like, that's a heavy one. That's a heavy one. And Payam was right, that there's an ambiguity, meto, his dead, his death, his death. That's exactly the way they're reading it. And they're saying that he was there with Sarah and he got up because he could see just over her body that the angel, you're next, buddy. I'm coming for you. I've been coming for you all along and you've escaped, but I'm going to get you. And so he recoils and jumps back. And then goes on to buy a plot of land, and he goes on to find a wife for Isaac, and he tries to settle down at the end. He has more to, but Abraham dies by the end of this Parsha. By the end of this week, Abraham is dead, and we can feel it. This Midrash can feel it in the death of Sarah. Oh, Abraham is right behind her. Death is coming for you, Abraham. And that also is what he's processing in this moment. The near death of his son, the maybe death of his daughter, the death of his beloved partner, and his own approaching death. So that's good. I think we went deep. That's good. All right, I'll see you next week.